Good evening, everybody. Jody and Judith today. It looks like the other guys probably slept in or whatever. And we're on chapter 10, the Stoics on the Extirpation of the Passion from Martha Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire. Yes. So what do you think about it? I guess if I want to say a few things first, I thought it was amazing. And I think it made me realize maybe I haven't read enough, but I realized that it's my favorite book, basically, at least at the moment. And it's been my favorite book for a long time. I think this is a really formative book for my particular take on Stoicism. And it obviously makes sense too because of the particular therapeutic kind of angle it takes. But here I just see it so neatly kind of laid out and really fairly comprehensively. I would say it's just an excellent work. It's brilliant. That's my view. What did you guys think?
Well, I'm now that we're 3/4 of the way through, and I have completely come to grips with her style, and I just love her style of writing. I struggled with it, I admit, in chapter 1, but I have really gained a thorough appreciation of how she tackles her topics and the way she researches, the way she presents the information. It's so clear and it's so well argued. And I forgive the fact that she sometimes may revisit or repeat things, but let's face it, any academic writing needs to do that to get their point across. So I appreciate it in a sense when I do see some ideas in that spiral way of presenting certain arguments, because really it's also interlinked again too, that it's hard not to spiral through aspects of it. And because I started reading my notes on chapter 1, and I recognise parts of chapter 1 have appeared here in chapter 10, and that's great, because it's just a whole reinforcement. It's great. I love it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter once again, and that's partly because it's a rereading. I'm probably getting a lot more out of it than I did when we started was at the end of 2020. That's right, that we were starting with this work right back then. So because I've learned a lot more about Stoicism since then, and yeah, maybe I'm just in a better position to appreciate her achievement, really. But yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
Do you think, the fact that it was written when in the early 90s, wasn't it? So, 30 years ago, can you think of a book that's come out since that would even be parallel to it? I can't, not that I'm that, I know of a few good Stoic academic works, but not like you would. Both of you would know many more titles than I would.
I think due to its accessibility, that's one thing, and also its scope, because it just covers so much territory, and also just its sort of literary appeal as well, because the way she throws in different tropes, and like you say, rather than it being just a bunch of separate little books on various schools, it's tied together with this narrative of Nikidian and her struggles with her own emotions and her own nature. I think I just see that as just, I don't know, I sound like a love-struck teenager or something. I just think the way she writes, I just think it's an incredible work.
Yeah. Well, to your point, Jody, about is there another equivalent? I mean, the interesting thing was that around exactly the same time, Pierre Hadot's Inner Citadel was being translated into English. So I think it had come out in French in the 80s, and then it was 10 years later when Michael Chase translated it into English. And so I think, in a sense, these two great works were appearing in parallel, really.
Have you read any criticisms of Michael Chase's translations at all? Have you seen any comments on?
Not really. I think he worked with Hadot. Well, that's my impression anyway. Yeah. yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case because Ado died in I think 2011 or whatever. So I think they worked together. Yeah. Did you have reason to write?
No, I just have read one or two critiques where people have tried to say, oh well, when I've translated it from the French, it's a lot different to what Michael Chase has done.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Yeah, but I just think that they're both so both the Inner Citadel and the Therapy of Desire, coming from very different traditions, somehow both came at around about the same time and both changed the game. So but really, it must have been an exciting period to be studying ancient philosophy.
And it makes me wonder sometimes if people had decided to put so much effort into, say, Epicurus, we might be having different conversations today. But well, yeah, we're just lucky that for some reason it's in the zeitgeist or whatever people want to talk about Stoicism.
She did give good coverage to the Epicureans. You've got to admit, like there was very in-depth coverage of their dogma.
And there is a couple of Epicurean Facebook sites. I'm a member of one, and they're into it, but they just don't have the traction that Stoicism has got. And I'd say part of it is because that link that people like to vociferously make between Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy. There's always been this kind of notion in critical psych and stuff like that the psi complex, they call it, has infiltrated every domain of life, sort of thing. So where psychology gets interested in things, it tends to generate interest elsewhere. Anyway, maybe that's a thing, maybe it's not. So let's jump in. Who wants to do part one? I've got like 3 pages of notes.
Why don't you start part one, Courtney, and then we'll both jump in.
It was a tough one to tackle because I really thought it's one of those ones that's so long. I probably should have just made some interesting questions. I say this every time, but instead I take way too many notes. So here we go. So part one concerns the Stoic conception of health. And it starts out with the view that only virtue is worth choosing for its own sake, and virtue all by itself suffices for a completely good human life. That is, for eudaimonia. Virtue is something unaffected by external contingency, both apparently as to its acquisition and as to its maintenance once acquired. Items that are not fully under the control of the agent, such as health, wealth, freedom from pain, the good functioning of the bodily faculties, have no intrinsic worth, nor is there causal relationship to eudaimonia, even that of an instrumental necessary condition. And it makes this interesting point that once the person has become virtuous, they cannot be corrupted, which is quite interesting. Then she says, we enter an area of controversy and obscurity, apparently to explain why and how the wise man will actually act in any way at all out there in the world, in contrast to Aristo of Chios, who held that everything other than virtue is a matter of perfect indifference. This left the wise man no reasons of his own for action. If he moves and acts at all, it is only in the way a stage actor does. Externals are to be appropriately preferred in many cases to their opposites. So that's quite an interesting point, and it's probably a tricky one in some regards, and it comes up throughout this this particular part one. This idea of that if virtue is the only good, then on what ground can we have indifferent things? Do you guys have any views on that before we trundle on ahead?
Yeah, I mean, the more I think about this, the more difficult it actually gets. And I'm currently rereading Cicero de Finibus books 3 and 4, partly because I've been reading Gill and he refers a lot to them. And yeah, I suppose it's important to realize how controversial these positions were in antiquity, and so how much criticism there was about this apparent well, first of all, the paradox on the one hand that virtue is the only good, but on the other hand, there are these things that we consider indifferent, but they have a value. And so this laid Stoicism open to claims of, well, you've got a double standard. What is this value that you ascribe to the indifference? So yeah, it was a hugely controversial position in antiquity, and I guess it's just important to bear that in mind as we go forward.
Yeah, that's right. So skipping ahead a little bit so we don't get bogged down in all the minutiae of that, she says that basically it's a kind of a short summary. Putting everything together, we are forced to conclude, however, what a large number of texts in fact assert, and this is sort of the crux of it, that external goods, all goods other than virtue, have no intrinsic value at all. And in this particular text, she offers a couple of interpretive strategies. One is something a bit technical. She calls it lexical ordering, that preferred indifference have a kind of second-class worth and are ordered below virtue. We satisfy all the claims of virtue first, but at any time when we have satisfied them, we may go on to satisfy the claims of the indifference. That one doesn't seem very satisfying to me, but the next one is a bit more compelling. It's the idea that we might claim that the worth of the indifference to derive from the productive relation in which they stand to virtue in the career of the child. I think this is more compelling, and given their developmental perspective. The child's natural orientation to these externals plays a crucial positive role in the process of development. When the child's reason matures and he or she develops virtue, she does not cease to be a natural being, and she still appropriately follows the animal aspects of her natural constitution when and as virtue permits. Obviously, that perspective is a neat one because it draws on the oikeiosis idea, which is very central to Stoic theory. Any opinions?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it does have more appeal intuitively, because it does at least locate it in a developmental context, which is, as we've seen, is what the Stoics and of course others as well, what the argument they ran around nature is to do with the development of the young organism. So yeah, I suppose it's more appealing intuitively. On the other hand, whether it really addresses the problem in full is I guess is still a question.
Yeah, that it is a bit of a thorny problem, and obviously in the background here, there's the Aristo of Chios. He's only concerned with the ethics, basically. Is that kind of the short summary of? And then of course you've got the cynics, who have a kind of a very strong stance that virtue is sufficient, right? It's the only thing required, and therefore you can pretty much disregard any external thing. I think in Long's book, the Epictetus, the Stoic Socratic way of life, he kind of makes a really interesting remark, something that stood out to me, that he kind of called the cynics something like the I don't know, I'm sort of paraphrasing badly, but I took it to be like Stoics on steroids. They were the evangelists. That's the word he used. So he said there was a kind of place for this preacher type Stoic, almost that kind of didn't need a physical abode because his calling by Zeus or God or whatever was to be wandering around showing off basically the power of this kind of philosophical attitude.
Yeah, so on the one hand, so it's like, and this is what's coming out in De Finibus, you know. So on the one hand, you've got the cynics who are the purists, the Puritans, if you like. But on the other hand, the Stoics and the Platonists agreed about nearly, you know, about a great deal, I suppose. And then the Stoics, on the one hand, yes, say virtue is only good. And on the other hand, they're making these accommodations. Even Zeno apparently is said to have made these accommodations around, you know, good health being a preferred, you know, so in a sense that they were the cynics to show up any any accommodations that the Stoics were trying to make with the other schools and with normal Greek or Roman life. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting tightrope, I guess, that some of the Stoics are trying to walk.
Yeah, and I think they make a lot of different arguments probably. So I think Epictetus makes a couple of comments about the cynics are kind of showing off a little bit, and that wouldn't be appropriate for a rational being. And that kind of makes sense if you think about like how easy it is to get caught into a kind of discipleship, you know, when you take on a philosophy, and that's kind of could be pathological. It's definitely not the kind of liberation that Stoic philosophy seems to be pointing towards, a more accordance with nature, as opposed to some sort of extraordinary asceticism, which might be something we force against nature sometimes. So I mean, I could see how they might try to make an argument like that. But anyway, she says, regardless, if we are faithful to the Stoic conception, we must avoid ascribing to indifference to external goods the sort of value that most ordinary people are seen to attach to them, and that Aristotle explicitly accords them. This includes love and friendship, which are in their nature relations with unstable and uncontrolled external items. We must not ascribe to them any intrinsic worth as constituent parts of the agent's eudaimonia, nor view them as absolutely indispensable necessary conditions for the eudaimon life. Are we all fairly in agreement with what eudaimonia is while we're talking about this? Because even recently on the Facebook site, someone was asking about eudaimonia. So it comes up frequently, and it's often called flourishing, or with the Rogerian piece, self-actualization might be a way of looking at it. Having a good indwelling spirit, I mean, that don't know if that's even helpful. What do you guys think?
I saw that Facebook post, and further on in the chapter, and we'll get to it, where there's a point where eudaimonia is described through as, is it proesis, which is wise and virtuous thinking, basically. And I nearly put that on the Facebook page because I just read it, but I didn't. I don't often put stuff on there. But yeah, so and I thought, well, that was an intriguing section in the chapter which addresses that idea of that Chrysippus actually, or one of them says, you know, that proesis is eudaimonia. That's it. They're the same.
Do you mean phronesis?
Phronesis.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, phronesis.
And yeah, that's a really interesting sort of idea, isn't it? That phronesis, which is like practical wisdom, is in a sense equivalent to, or in some ways equal to, the eudaimonic life, which is the preferred end of existence. It's
because that's basically, and then later in the chapter, then Seneca will remind us that is the basis of Stoic joy, where we talk about the effect, you know, that we are, again, this allowance that the Stoics make for effect, you know, is only in this realm of these very reduced, you know, these three reduced sort of foci, and the idea that the joy is a calm and reserved and you know, a joy that is not overt. You know, it's an internal joy, and it comes from this idea of virtuous thinking, of virtue realized in that way. Yeah.
So it's a kind of joy, perhaps, that arises from the right use of reason.
Mm.
Yeah, and one thing that Gil talks about in his book, I will say, is the importance of wisdom in selecting indifference, selecting wisely between indifference. That's kind of key, as it turns out, to the appropriate practice of Stoicism.
Can I point out a little bit just beyond where you were up to, if we can just stretch forward a little bit there? There's it does go from there into we're still on page 362, because it's got here, you know, this, because she's taking this whole chapter in the light of extirpation of the passion. So we are always going to be focused on that removal of passion. So she's got here, the Stoics will even deny that love, friendship, food, clothing, shelter are necessary for eudaimonia. They are committed to denying the intrinsic worth of external worldly action and even the intrinsic worth of life itself, according to Diogenes Laertius is quoted to have said, which that's a strong statement, isn't it? You know, that it's even
well, we know that if they can't act virtuously, they are open to death, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's right. And this is one of the, I guess, one of the paradoxes of the Stoics, you know, that that the organism has always this impulse, this horme, to preserve its life. But on the other hand, if the conditions are such that he or she can't act virtuously or in that circumstance, or that they're that the wise decision is towards not continuing, they've got that option to do that. So yeah, that's again one of the seeming contradictions of Stoicism, I would say.
I was seeing it as even broader than that, the intrinsic worth of life itself. You know, like it took me a little bit back to Schopenhauer the other night, you know, like we're better off not being born. You know, that idea that you know, virtue is even above life itself, in a sense, you know, or human or biological human life, you know.
Yeah, or it can be, but only in kind of exceptional circumstances. And that's, but again, this is one of the areas where again, Stoicism laid itself open to critique from people who say, well, you know, if the organism has got this eternal propensity to preserve its life, and you say that it's acceptable to end it, well, you know, what's going on? So yeah, it's one of those things that
a bit of a
had to be defended.
Yeah.
I guess.
And then the other point they raised there is not only traditional external goods like wealth and honor, and not only relational goods like friends and family, political rights and privileges, but also individual forms of virtuous activity, such as acting courageously, justly and moderately, are held to be worthless, as they can be cut off or impeded by accidents beyond our control. And that's another interesting point, that the virtues themselves can, in a sense, be impeded by accidents and are therefore open to effect to the effects of fate. And but you know, but I thought we were meant to be above fate, that our virtue was going to rescue us and lift us above the actions of fate on us. So that was just still on 362. Do you see where I'm?
Yeah, well, that clearly just undermines we shall build on this, it undermines that idea that it's about what takes place in the world. Obviously, it's the intentions that we have, the kind of quality of our desire that is more important than anything that happens in the world. So, and she makes that point straight after, right? She says that it's like the spear thrower. It's not necessarily about there's no interest whether the spear hits the mark or not in the end, in the final analysis. It's managing, having a kind of state of soul which is constantly straining towards the right kind of use of of wisdom, the right kind of use of reason, so that its intentions are, it's always striving for excellence, regardless of what it can actually produce in the world. I guess that's what I'm fumbling around trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's well put. That's well put, because yes, that's right. The wise man must be self-sufficient. His life always eudaimon, in good spirit, no matter what happens.
Yeah, even if everything's going wrong around him, presumably, because he's not hung up on external things. What do you guys actually think about it personally? I mean, I think a lot about it, and I think it's quite possible to live this way. I think a lot of people would find it like impossible if they hadn't experienced it. But I guess if you have a taste of the experience, it's actually quite satisfying and liberating. And I think this sort of philosophy really talks to people who value freedom. And you would think, and I think the Stoics would think, that everybody has an equal value for their existential freedom. But I'm not sure if that's the case. I'm not 100% sure. In fact, there might be a whole bunch of people out there that are quite comfortable with less control over their freedom than some other people are. I was just wondering what you guys thought about that, because I think it biases people who are extremely interested in guarding their freedom, and makes us more kind of passionate about these sort of approaches. What did you think about that?
Well, just in the 2 years that I've been studying Stoicism, and just in my relation to my family, very quickly, like 2 years ago, I would have been very reactive and trying to hold on to what I thought was freedom, and react against them strongly to claim my freedom. But now it's like a total 180, where now I look from outside, I look like I'm behaving completely in the opposite way. I'm compliant, I'm helpful, I'm calm, it's actually, and I feel more free. So that's the opposite. It's the whole, I feel absolutely calm and peaceful and totally in control, and I still feel like I've got total freedom, even though it might appear different to an outside observer. But anyway.
That's great, Jodie. And I think that, I mean, to your point, Courtney, I think certainly my experience as well is that the Stoic perspective of being accepting of what happens, and not being reactive, not regarding chance occurrences as provocations or problems necessarily, is such a liberating experience. I totally agree with you, Jodie, around that. And I would say in my life too, that's made a huge difference. And yeah, it's like Epictetus says, there's always two handles. You can take the handle where something's a problem, or you can take the other handle and regard it as not a problem and just as it is. So yeah, I think people often tend to, and there can be a number of reasons for it. There can be a desire for attention, or there can be other tensions going on in relationships or whatever. There can be a whole different range of reasons why people do this, but some people seem to want to take the difficult handle out of a situation. I don't know. What's your view, Courtney?
I think it's really interesting. Obviously, there's a normative idea here in the background that having freedom is better than not having freedom. Health is better than being unhealthy. And that if you didn't have freedom, if you chose to have a life based on passion and ups and downs, well, then from the Stoic perspective, you're not a very healthy person. But in reality, if I have these conversations with people at a very honest level, they will see generally that my choice is a kind of, what's the word, that I've eroded some part of my life away, and that's not a very attractive option. And for example, there's a guy he's got really a very, very extreme up and down psychological life, and sometimes you even feel suicidal. But when you really get down to this sort of conversation with him, he will say he loves the mania, he loves the highs of the experience so much that he'll put up with months and months and months of misery, because it colors his life. He says things like, my misery, my dreariness, my self-loathing motivates me to want to be a better person, to change. And the argument for stability and tranquility sounds to him like a loss of everything that he would really enjoy, the passionate striving and all the rest of it. Which is, if you don't buy the normative aspect that the Stoics have in the background, then it's really hard to try and convince somebody that this might be an attractive option. So what makes it attractive? It's a weird one. I'm not sure if I have a proper answer. Yeah. Anyway, shall we move ahead, or do you want to say something more about that? No.
Just that lovely bit there. Like you were saying, the virtue is imagined as striving or straining, right?
Yes,
yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, and the good person is always using his soul, which is perfect.
Yeah.
Says
these inner activities are explicitly said to be unaffected by worldly contingency. So that was finishing off where you were before. And they are held to be complete in themselves, quite apart from their emergence into the world, complete from the very moment they begin. And this is what you were saying, Jodie, about your experience. As Seneca says, the wise man can simply stay home, for at home inside himself, he has whatever he needs. And paradoxically, he's still active in the world. That's where I wanted to make that connection with what you were saying. It looks like you're not claiming your freedom, but actually you feel more free. In this, they not only break with the traditional external goods, to which even Aristotle does not ascribe intrinsic worth, but they go further and break with one of the claims about human good, to which, as Aristotle tells us, ordinary people will most readily give their agreement, namely, that the good life consists in activity, and that this activity goes on in the world. Now, that's really interesting, because obviously I think when you say it like that, it makes it look like the Stoics aren't really interested in activity, but clearly they are. Clearly they're very interested in political engagement. But I think the impetus completely starts out from their own internal inner dimension, and that's what counts, rather than starting out with a political perspective.
And to just develop that idea a little bit. So Seneca will, and this is how the whole Letters to Lycidius came about, because he was prevented, I guess, from continuing a political career. And the same with Cicero's philosophical works. They came about in enforced retirement. So, but Seneca sometimes says, well, he says a couple of different things around it, but one thing he says, that in any situation, what I do is I try and find some way I can learn, or some way I can make use of the situation. So I guess my point is that for the Stoics, even apparent retirement can be investigation, it can be reflection, even apparent inactivity isn't necessarily inactivity. It can have a constructive and it can be deployed in the pursuit of wisdom, which ultimately, again, is still the pursuit of virtue. So this is again another of these apparent contradictions in Stoicism. This embracing of retirement, because the self is self-sufficient, the wise man is constant and always the same, but at the same time using that leisure or that retirement to pursue wisdom ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that I think everyone knows now, but it's something that the modern Stoic needs to be careful of, is that it doesn't mean finding everything within yourself and being so self-sufficient that you no longer care about anybody else or are connected to anybody else. It's definitely got nothing to do with that. And anyone who stops there probably has misunderstood Stoicism and ought to think a little bit more deeply and go a bit deeper into the arguments. But she says here that, and this I think taps into that feeling, because at the end of that she says, by declaring that all external worldly activity is unnecessary might ease the ethical agent's burden in one way by making him less dependent on ungovernable conditions. In another way, it increases it by focusing all ethical attention on the internal doings of the heart. I made a point of that because I think that's very true, and it really forces someone to take responsibility in a very profound way for things that other people can't necessarily judge you for because they're hidden, but you become very invested and accountable to and aware of your commitments to not only yourself through your own use of what's being given to you by nature, but also towards those connections you share with other people, whether people see it or not. So there might not even be a reward then in that case, you know.
Yeah, I marked that one too. I thought that was a lovely sentence.
Yeah, and I think that's very demanding. And I think a lot of people, if they sensed that clearly about Stoicism, would balk at that too, because that's quite a demanding and aesthetic kind of approach. The Stoics are committed to denying the moral relevance of luck and external circumstances, so they will be committed to judging people for what their intentions and motives and thoughts are. We've kind of said this, quite apart from all worldly conditions over which agents do not have full control. The only virtue we can safely applaud is a pure error-proof virtue. Virtues without any counterbalancing inner forces. She makes some comparison here about Aristotle's self-control in Criteia and Acrasia. The Stoic can recognize is one that, anyway, I'm going to skip that because it gets into a little bit of detail. Unless you have something to say about that. My Aristotle's lousy, Judith. Do you have anything about you want to say about the difference between his version of self-control and Acrasia?
Yeah, that's something I investigated in great detail many years ago. So, but I'm pretty rusty about it. What I will say is, this is a piece, a bit where she's doing an amazing thing, really, in steel manning one of the most sort of counterintuitive doctrines of the Stoics, which is that the only wise person is one who never errs at all, and all the others are fools. So the way she sets it up is so clever. She says she really explicates it, and she explains how in the Stoic viewpoint there is no moral difference at all between the criminal who never gets a chance to commit his crime and the one who does. Mm-hmm. And we can kind of get that, you know, as she explains. We can see that motivation is key, and this is part of why the Stoics would say that, you know, that it's only the very rare, of course, wise person who never errs at all, and everyone else is a fool. And, you know, which of us can say that all our motivations are good ones? None of us can say that, you know. We're all in that position. And so she shows how it has a force, and despite its counterintuitive nature. I think it's so brilliant.
Yeah, well said. Part 2, who's going to do that?
I'm happy to do part 2. And just in closing part 1, I just some notes there, that Stoic virtues are all forms of knowledge. Yes, we've covered that. Yeah, but I really did enjoy reading her. I had to read that section a number of times, that on her descriptions of the various forms of our intrinsic motivations and things like that, and how they're judged morally, you know. It's really well explained. Anyway, here we go.
Oh,
Number
so,
two.
so Jodie, just before you jump into section 2, can I just say hi, Lee? I can't
Lee's
see you,
here.
but thank you for being here, and don't let us just talk over the top of you.
Please jump in if anytime. Okay. All right, so I'll start on 2. So Chrysippus' thesis is that the passions are forms of false judgment or false belief. Right? So that's a definition of the passions. They're false judgments. Emotions like fear, grief, anger, pity, erotic love are violent motions in the soul versus calm reasoning. We're on page 367. How can they be equated? Nikidian may ask. Passions are not seen as subrational stirrings of our animal nature, but modifications of the rational faculty, which can be moderated and eventually cured using the arts of reason. So false beliefs can be removed. Chrysippus wrote 4 books on the passions, the 4th being about the cure, but apparently there was also other readings of those 4 books that also insinuated there were descriptions of cures in the first 4 books as well. Later Stoics like Diogenes of Babylon saw music as, this is in the notes, later Stoics like Diogenes of Babylon saw music as a cure to tame the animal part, the non-cognitive part, whereas poetry was seen as a cognitive part, and so music and poetry had a role to play, the Stoics felt, in calming the soul. So Chrysippus is, so we leave that page 367 with that idea that Chrysippus is saying that we can cure the passions, basically. So 368, this thesis is a candidate for truth, says Nussbaum. Intuitive acceptability are closely linked, in most contemporary, intuitive I've got a bit of something left out there. In most contemporary ethical thought, and in the thought of Chrysippus, he and Aristotle were concerned with ordinary thought and language. So yes, even gestures with subtle and careful attention to nuance and structure. So in these books that Chrysippus apparently wrote, he concerned himself very deeply with the way we communicate in an everyday way in our language, and the way we express ourselves to each other, and the way the passions are shown in our language and gestures. Galen had criticisms. Unlike the appetites, we're on 369. Galen had criticisms. Unlike the appetites, like thirst and hunger, emotions have a cognitive element. They embody ways of interpreting the world. The emotion can be evaluated as true or false, rational or irrational. So that belief is the ground of the feeling. And the modification of belief can then modify emotion. So just to stress that again, that the different emotions are not the appetites, they're different. Page 370, also shown in, and this is also shown in Aristotle and Epicurus. So also, and I've got number 1, 2, and I think it goes down to, anyway, let me go. Also, 1, beliefs on which emotions are based include our values of what is good and bad, worthwhile and worthless, helpful or noxious. To cherish something, to give it high value, gives joy, and fear when it is threatened, grief at its loss, anger when it is damaged, envy if someone else has it, pity if someone else loses it. So that idea of, it's based on our values. The beliefs on which emotions are based are about the values we give them, of the things, the externals, the value of the externals. Number 2, this high value of these external vulnerable goods, which can be affected by the world, and not simply at home inside of them. Oh gosh, sorry, I should have reviewed this. This high value of external vulnerable goods, which can be affected by the world, includes loved ones, city, possessions, conditions of action, presupposing we are hostages to fortune. The emotions based on circumstantial or perspectival considerations than by their grounding beliefs. Whoa, this is really, really not well written. I'm sorry, folks. This high value of external vulnerable goods, which can be affected by the world, includes loved ones, city, possessions, conditions of action, presupposing we are hostages to fortune. The emotions based on circumstantial or perspectival considerations than by their grounding beliefs. Removal of a sense of particularity or specialness will eradicate strong emotion. So again, it's still, she's still pushing this idea of the high value. You know, when we give something high value, we're going to have a great emotional response. They were on page 371. Is there anything you want to say there, folks? Or do you want me just to belt through?
No, she's just emphasizing the cognitive elements that make up emotion, and then the next part she'll unpack that a bit further.
Yeah, that's right. So she gets up to here. She says, so Chrysippus gave us four reasons. So one was necessity. So the relevant belief is necessary for the passion. So the belief is necessary for the passion. That was like one of his theses. And then 2, constituent element. The constituent element is the belief is a necessary constituent element in the passion. So it's necessary, it is part of it. And then 3, sufficiency. The belief is sufficient for the passion. So that's all you need. The belief is all you need for the passion to occur. And then 4, identity. The belief is identical to the passion. So in these 4 steps, we're getting sort of stronger claims. Each step we make, we're making a stronger and stronger claim, to the point in number 4, identity. The belief is identical to the passion. And this was something that was a little bit controversial, I believe, that was argued or critiqued even amongst the Stoics.
I'll just jump in there, Jodie. I think I don't think these are being presented as Chrysippus's positions. I think these are kind of 4 different interpretations, or 4 different strands within the tradition.
Oh, thank you.
So different scholars will have interpreted the remaining texts in these different 4 ways. And again, we've got to always remind ourselves how fragmentary our evidence is, and that's why there is this variation in the different scholarly interpretations.
And also,
sorry,
the Chrysippus takes the final view, though, is her argument that he identifies belief. Belief has an identical relationship with the passion.
Yeah, that was his main one, wasn't it? He was.
Whereas she's saying other thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and the like, that was my reading, had a different idea exactly about what belief was, and it's important. It's not a side thing, because she will then spend the next whole section explaining why it's important.
All right. Well, I'll quickly finish this bit, and then you can go on with number 3, either of you. So refinements would consider a current passions or entrenched states, level of belief or value of external uncontrolled items, belief I may suffer by another's agency, or I have been wronged. So these various standings would be some of the refinements to these ideas. Page 372. So P. So what have I've got? P. Would that be Plato? No. Who would that be? Plato and Epicurus hold one. Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. So Plato and Epicurus would agree with statement 1 that it's necessary. So that the necessity, the relevant belief, is necessary for the passion. So Plato and Epicurus would hold that. Epicurus might hold 2 and 3. Aristotle holds 1 and 2, and Zeno held 1. But Zeno said belief causes a fluttering feeling, which is the passion, that's different. So all these people defend a close connection of passion and belief. So, all of them do, but stops short of identity, as Chrysippus would have said. All right, well, that's the end of section 2.
And I think part of that point too is she was more explicit in another chapter, but she said basically that you can't strictly say that, well, she says there's 2 different ways in which you can describe the passions, for example, or beliefs, for example, because they're the same thing in this view, as being rational or irrational. So from the normative view, it can be rational or irrational, depending on whether or not it's true, like in accord with nature. But on the other hand, and this is the idea that passion is identical, I guess, this is one way of looking at it, is these things are all cognitive. So they can't strictly be irrational. They're all rational. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And that's, you can kind of understand that on a common sense level by, again, coming back to, say, the Epictetus position that however weird somebody's behavior seems, it seemed good to them. Basically, they had a reasoning process that led them to do that thing, which might seem completely irrational to external observers, but they had their reasons. So yes, and you're right, Courtney, that is one of the cruxes here, that that you can have a completely cognitive view of the passions, but at the same time that might not fit what we would normally call rational. So I can go on with section 3 if you're happy.
Yeah, you do 3.
Okay. So, and with it, so as Nussbaum states that Chrysippus is asserting the identity of beliefs and passions. And again, I haven't gone back and looked at our surviving fragments in Diogenes Laertius to confirm. So I'll go with her here and accept what she's saying, that he does. But what leads him to this position? He says that judgment that is identical with the passion is in itself a pleonas asdusa ome, an excessive inclination. But then he wants to also say it's a judgment. Why does he want to say this? Okay, so then she rehearses the differences between the Platonic position, that there are 3 different elements in the soul, in contrast to which the Stoics had a very different view. And she relies to some extent on Galen. Now, Galen, of course, was the doctor of Marcus Aurelius and a very important authority, but may have been not entirely a fair-minded authority when it came to the Stoics. But anyway, Galen tells us that Chrysippus argued first for the existence of some alogos dunamis, some irrational capability, some irrational power in the soul, and then went on to consider the relative merits of different views. And so there are interpretations that Galen is trying to push a Platonic interpretation onto the Stoics. So that's a kind of a scholarly dispute that's ongoing. But what, as she says on the next page, 374, what needs explaining is precisely the fact that is being invoked as an explanation, namely why Chrysippus decides to make all passional states the conditions of a single part or faculty, and the same faculty that does our practical reasoning. Why does he think this the best and most plausible account? So then she goes into the basics of the Stoic formation of beliefs. So the first step of a judgment is an assent to an appearance. And then she explains how Nikidian will go through this process. First of all, the sun appears to her as being about a foot across. That's the way it looks to her. That's what she sees as. But she has acquired some beliefs which conflict with that, so she's going to reject that appearance. She says to herself, that's the way it looks to me, but of course that's not the way things really are. And so she ends that, Nussbaum ends that page by an interesting sentence where she says, and unless we have an anachronistic Humean picture of cognition, according to which it is motionless, performing calculations without commitment, it seems in no way strange to say that it is reason itself that reaches out and takes that appearance to itself, saying, so to speak, yes, that's the one I'll have. That's the way things are. So it's such a beautiful way she describes the process of assenting to that particular judgment. The extra element of selection, recognition, and commitment that sets us apart from the beasts is taken to be the contribution of reason. So then we get to a far more sensitive case, I suppose. Someone dear to Nikidian dies. And of course, this happens to all of us. We're all subject to this happening in our lives. And Nussbaum very beautifully gives an account of how that person's disappearance breaks so many threads in Nikidian's life. She represents to herself the breaks, the disjunctures that are occurring. But what Nussbaum insists and says, what we must insist on, however, is that the appearance is propositional. Its content is that such and such is the case, and it is evaluative. So the evaluative judgment is that the dead person is of enormous importance, but we're still just at the state of appearing. So what happens next? So, and of course, the Stoic response to a dear person who's died is absolutely key. And of course, it's going to be key to all the Hellenistic schools, as it is, of course, to all of us. And it's why the Stoics have a genre of consolation. That's why Seneca addresses himself to Marcia. You know, this is how you respond to a death, because it's one of the most important things that will happen in our lives. Chrysippus will say, this person is in a state of denial. She is not really assenting to that proposition that the person has died and she won't see him again. She may be saying the words, but there is something in her that is resisting it. She may be assenting to the proposition that a mortal being has died, or even just possibly to the proposition that X, the man she loves, has died. What she has not assented to is the proposition that the person whom she loves and values above all others has died. For to recognize this is to be violently disturbed. Okay, so towards the end of that page, this is page 376, we should now insist that the appearances that the Stoic agent either acknowledges or does not are similarly appearances with a marked evaluative element. They must make a claim about what, from the point of view of the agent, is valuable and fine, or the contrary. It's all about value. Now, second, and this is halfway down the next page, 377, the propositions ascribe to the item in question not only some value, but a serious or very high value, or, depending on the proposition, disvalue. Similarly, accounts of the dispositional conditions underlying particular episodes of passion, make them equivalent to a belief that something is very worth pursuing. Valde expetenda in Latin. Again, a passage of Posidonius, reporting Chrysippus, speaks to the conviction that a thing contains a great benefit. And that's at the top of 378. Finally, the belief must have a certain content. It must be concerned with vulnerable external things, things that can fail to be present, things that can arrive by surprise and that are not fully under our control. And as she points out, that's a common ground between Chrysippus and the pre-Stoic tradition.
This, that 3-part list you just gave, they must have be valuable. They must they have to actually have very, very high value, and they must have a certain kind of content. This is the sort of stuff too that's really attractive to the cognitive behavioral crowd, because this is really interesting from a therapeutic point of view, because obviously it's telling you what kind of beliefs constitute passions, and that these kind of beliefs are identical to passion. In fact, if you have a belief that has these parts to it, then it's a passion. And the thing that really struck me about this telling too, sorry to butt in, I was musing about this, is that often we forget, and I think Nussbaum really nails it, we forget how we're not dealing with individual propositions alone. Like, we often act as if we are. We're like, oh, okay, so what was it about that belief that got you so stirred up? But it's more like, and she tells us that when the person dies, there's a whole network of propositions that are intimately connected with one another. And so the false proposition that, that carries those sort of problematic beliefs, such that it's the most important thing, this person will never be replaced in your life has been diminished in some way at their loss, all those sorts of things carry through and affect everything else that it's connected to, like where I go for dinner, and the memories I have about X, Y, and Z, and so on and so forth. So your whole life. So it means almost that holding on to these powerful beliefs infects your whole life. And that's why I can see this idea of extirpation, because you have to kind of find these infected core beliefs and strip them out in order to preserve the health of everything else that's in your inner life. Anyway, that's all I want to say, because I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is a complex, and that's because we are people with complex relationships embedded in the world. Absolutely. And as the Stoics would say, we're part of a closely bound network. So yes, that's partly why these beliefs are so powerful, I guess, is because they're not just in one dimension. They range across all of our being. Okay, so we've got to thesis 3 on our list, says Nussbaum, towards the end of 378. The judgment is an embracing of an appearing proposition, the real embracing of or assent to a certain sort of evaluative proposition. It entails the emotion, but we still need to know what leads Chrysippus to make the emotion itself a function of reason, and to make it identical with the assent that is the judgment. So why should we see this kind of state as a state of reason? And this is a wonderful passage, it seems to me, and I was really struck by this in this.
Me too.
Yeah.
This was lovely. It really made it all was like a real moment of revelation.
Yeah. It is so brilliant.
Yeah.
So, and we, like with Nikidian, we are trying to evaluate what's going on here. We try and examine ourselves. This is the grief, a fluttering off in her ear or a trembling in her stomach? No, these answers seem wrong. We want to give the grief a seat that is specifically human. And that makes perfect sense. you know, we could, she says, we could invent a special emotional part of the soul to house it on the Platonic model. But actually, the Stoic picture is more intuitively right, because it's where it seems to belong with our reason, not in a different part of our being. But as she admits at the top of page 380, there does still seem to be an affective part of emotion that we might have difficulty housing in the soul's rational part. We've begun to respond to this point by stressing the fact that the Stoic reason is dynamic, not static. And sorry, just in passing, that's something that's come across to me in the Gill book. A lot of the reasoning there seems to be rather static, not dynamic. So, but she's absolutely right to identify the Stoic response as dynamic. As she says, it moves, embraces, refuses. It can move rapidly or slowly. It can move directly or with hesitation. She gestures to Sophocles. Creon, confronted by the death of his son, says, I accept this knowledge and am shaken in my reason. That's in Antigone. So that seems right. We are shaken in our reason by this kind of thing. So towards the end of the page, when Nikidian grieves, she does not first of all coolly embrace the proposition, my wonderful lover is dead, and then set about grieving. No, the full real recognition of that dreadful event is the upheaval. It is like putting your hand straight down on the sharp point of a nail. The passion is a very violent motion that carries us along, pushing us violently towards action. But this does not imply that it is a form of recognition, for as Chrysippus insists, it is belief itself that contains the disorderly kinetic element. What an amazing thing to say. Knowing can itself be violent. And so then we find Seneca adding something useful here. Sometimes he says the presence of an appearance might evoke a reaction, even when the appearance itself is not accepted or taken in, but just, so to speak, on the surface. And he mentions these things, these proto-passions, at the top of page 381. Sudden pallor, a leap of the heart, or when you hear a sudden noise, sexual excitation, all of these bodily movements can be caused by the appearance alone without assent or judgment. But those aren't passions. They're proto-passions, they're reflexes. It's when the appearance has been allowed in that we get, in the act of recognition, the tumult of mind that is the passion. What an absolutely brilliant account she's just given of this whole process. Okay, so as she says, in short, we have here a dynamic conception of practical knowing or judging, in which judgment is not a cool, inert act of intellect, but an acknowledgement with the core of being that such and such is the case. And she also, in that, she kind of acknowledges as well the corporeality that the Stoics always insisted on. You know, everything is body. You know, our body and our soul are implicated. So halfway down the page, she says, Chrysippus adds one further element to his account. So this was fascinating, I thought. The judgment to be equivalent to a passion must be prosphaton, which means not yet spoiled or digested, fresh. And in the literature, it's used frequently of food, but also of recently deceased corpses, where before decomposition has set in. And so there's a kind of implication of pristine character. So it seems to emphasize that there's a temporal element here. Over time, the response will no longer be fresh and will change. It will be different. And that's what we see on the next page, 382. When like food, like as we digest food and the loss has over time been assimilated and digested, Nikidian will still have the same judgment, but it seems wrong to say that she still has the passion. Loss of freshness is portrayed in the text as a temporal matter. And she adds here, it may seem that here Chrysippus gives the game away. For isn't he admitting, after all, there's something more to grieving and believing that? And isn't this something, this freshness and irrational element? As she says, rightly, yes and no. Yes, having a certain belief, as we now see, is not, as we now see, sufficient for grieving. But no, because the difference is itself a cognitive difference. It's to do with our perception of the elapse of the time. When the proposition has been there for a long time, with the element of surprise gone, it's lost its sharpness. For example, Nikidian doesn't any longer look forward to the happy times that she would share with her lover. She doesn't have the belief or expectation that he will be with her. But these are cognitive changes. As Chrysippus says, the things don't present the same appearances. So, as she goes on to say it, through page 383, it's got interesting implications for the analysis of ethical conflict. On the Platonic parts of the soul view, reason is pulling this way, desire pushing that way. But rather on the Stoic view, Chrysippus would have us see the conflict as an oscillation of the whole soul between recognition and denial. I thought this was so beautifully put. He speaks of the soul turning and shifting as a whole, not as the conflict between two parts, but the turning the single reason in two different directions, which escapes our notice because of the sharpness and swiftness of the change. At one moment she assents, at another moment she distances herself from the knowledge, saying, no, you will find someone else, or that is just one person like others. Or in the words of Seneca, you have buried the one you love, go look for someone to love. It is better to replace your love than to weep for him.
You know, this is so intuitive and true in the therapy room, because I really like this model called motivational interviewing, because it works exactly like this. And it's not like some blind part of the soul versus reason. It's reason against reason. And it comes up every time in addiction. I talk about it every day when you're talking about addiction, because basically the way the model works is that people are characterized by ambivalence. It means reason is going in two directions simultaneously. They want to change, but they don't want to change. And that's how you approach the problem. And you can literally watch it. You can say to them a change statement, like, maybe it's time to think about cutting down your use. And they will automatically counteract with the not change part, opposite side. It's like reflexively, the soul just goes straight back and goes, yeah, but I'm not ready to do that. And so you trick them and you do the same thing. You take their side of the argument and go, yeah, you're not ready to do that. I see that. They'll go, no, but I really need to make a change. And it's just amazing. You can actually talk to people about how this oscillation works, and they'll have an argument in front of you, a group of people, and it'll just go like that. It'll go oscillation, 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 where because they're ambivalent about the subject matter, i.e., making changes about substance use, for example. That's a good example because they're on the same page, they're arguing about the same thing. It just goes back and forth in this really vicious oscillation. And the more ambivalent a person is, the more painful it is for them, because they feel paralyzed. They feel like their whole being is being pulled in two different directions. And it's one of the painful aspects of addiction. And once you understand that that's what you're dealing with, you can have quite a lot of compassion for the person. Yeah. I just wanted to add that because it's so real. It's so intuitive. It appears to be the case. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it underlines, again, that Epictetan position. Well, why on earth are they doing this? Because at times, maybe the majority of the time, it seems good to them. They have reasons to do that. Oh, I'm going to do this because they've always got a reason, even though they can also see the reasons on the other side. You're absolutely right, Courtney. It's just, it's a profound insight, I think, into how people operate. It's not that they've got an emotional section of their being that's pushing them one way. You know, the emotions and the reasons can be, as you say, they can be presented in contrast to each other in successive moments. It's incredible how insightful this is.
Yeah, and it tells us too that if it's got those component parts, those beliefs, you know, that it's of great value to me, that's based on an unstable external thing. If it has those parts, then it's hard to do something about, because it has that passionate, a stabby kind of, well, you know, that violently moving element to it. So obviously our treatment then is to remove those elements, like the evaluative components and it being based on external things. But the trouble is, like, most people aren't willing to get rid of those things. So back at square one there.
Okay, so where are we? So Chrysippus claims that the story of oscillation and shifting perspective is a more accurate account of the inner life of mourning than the story of battle and struggle. The oscillation may, of course, be extremely rapid. And yeah, just to underline that, of course, we know people who are mourning somebody, they can have intervals of you know, lightheartedness or whatever. And again, it's this oscillation going on.
And also, I just want to say, compared to, say, I don't know, Plato or whatever, this is such a compelling psychological account, because it tells a story of the whole soul. Not only talking about something intellectual, like, you know, propositions and the way that you can visualize propositions in language, but she showed us how you can picture it, these things, through, you know, the network of connections, the way Nikidian sees, you know, the coffee shop or whatever that is now lonely and empty because her deceased partner's not there anymore, but also this physical aspect that can be felt. So there's all these layers to this experience, which makes it much more detailed and layered, a phenomenological kind of account, if you like, because what we got is we've got the imagination, and we've got this deep somatic yearning as well, this feeling within the body, and this pushing and pulling within the soul itself. Yeah, and I find that extremely intuitive, and it speaks to a much better and deeper argument than a merely intellectual one.
Yeah, 100%. So towards the end of this page 384, the picture of oscillation can explain one further feature of the experience of mourning, and that comes to your point, Courtney. This is a phenomenological account as well. You know, that's what the Stoics were doing. It's extraordinary what they were doing. That the parts model fails to notice. It was the fact that Nikidian noticed herself looking for someone else to love, that threw her back, so to speak, into the arms of her grief. It was the cognitive content of one picture that reminded her violently of the opposing picture. As the ebbing tide is followed inexorably by the flood. And the parts model cannot explain this rhythm, except to say that sometimes one force, sometimes the other, wins the upper hand. Chrysippus' view strikingly anticipates the account of mourning in Proust. Now, I haven't read Proust, so I can't confirm this. When it suggests that the explanatory connections are tighter and work through the very cognitive content of the opposing pictures. But I do know, do know about Marcel and Albertine. Marcel's grief and love for Albertine, until that love is like a raging lion, takes over the heart with its own violent view of the world. So here it is a vision of undifferentiated flatness that summons a vision of a single point, which returns with triumphant force, as in pain she embraces it. Now, notice that we have here subtly delineated two conceptions of mourning: the mourning of time, which is compatible with the retention of recognition and acknowledgement, and the mourning of denial, which cuts short the natural process of grief's digestion by veering over to a different view of the world. If Nikidian mourns in the first way, the way most people mourn, she will find her grief diminishing gradually as her judgment loses its freshness. She will eventually stop grieving altogether, but she will continue to retain the very same judgment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it brings us back to the really early point that most people would not choose the second way of living their life because they want to really grieve in this powerfully passionate way, and they know it will end because the freshness wears off, it decays, so to speak. But the point here is that they're never cured. Even though the pain will go away, they're still open to the effect of that kind of proposition the next time they fall in love. They haven't treated the actual disease, really. That's the role of this freshness thing. And it seems that Crispus is recommending this way of denial, which is an interesting way of putting it, because what is it a denial of? It's a denial of the evaluative aspects of the proposition, I take it, right? But what if those evaluative parts weren't there in the first place? Then it's not really a denial, right? It's just that you've formed more appropriate propositions in the first place. But how would that happen? Well, I guess normatively you would say that's what we ought to do, and that's what is possible. It's available because we're made that way. So we have to make sure that we're not forming the wrong kind of propositions. If we do make the kind of propositions that have this evaluative content, that it seems like if they're somehow cast in stone, or whether they degrade or whether they're removed, I don't know, but it would seem then that we would have to do some sort of denial until they become correct again. I'm not really sure how the details would pan out. You got any ideas about that?
Well, there's an interesting statement here that I've written, the grief is extinguished by the refusal of the evaluative proposition, as you said, Courtney, and the acceptance of a contradictory proposition, right? So she will deny the value of something that she valued supremely. But then it says, new love will be different in consequence. Each beloved, and I've written, each beloved is an instantiation of the general form of needs and desires without anything to do with the individuation of the loved one. So it's sort of indicating like a movement towards the experience of love itself, above and beyond the actual individual. Yeah. So it's not even attaching to the individual. It sort of becomes more of a practice of,
Yeah.
like a way of living, a way of practicing. Yeah.
Well, I'm reminded of, a couple of things here. And I think this is where Stoicism as a kind of a system, or that's not a very good word, but a way of life, that's a better word. Part of these issues would be obviated if we were to practice premeditatio malorum properly, and then we wouldn't be in the situation of being taken by surprise by the sudden death of someone we love. So that's part of the remedy, I guess, or the preferred approach. And so the issue about the instantiation, Jodie, I think I'm reminded of Seneca's, again, the Consolation of Marcia. So part of what he tries to turn her attention to, rather than mourning for her son who died 3 years prior, is to remind her that her adult son had 2 little children of his own. So why doesn't she turn her love and care and grief in a productive direction towards her, towards the little children? So in that way, so other people could instantiate that love, which was originally towards the person who's died. So I think, there's that practical aspect, which it might sound a bit callous, perhaps, at first glance, but it's also got a practical violence around having a relationship with the living rather than the person who's deceased.
And that's a good point, because you really draw out the denial there, because she could focus on the death of the son, because that's still known to her, but instead she denies that and instead focuses on the grandchildren or whoever, and they become the focus, until of course she recollects that they are the children of the son that will never be given back to her again, and she will experience the pain anew. So it's not a complete cure. And that's why I think there's a lot that we could say about the principles of Stoicism, the actual core beliefs, the dogma, if you like, because I think that's where the remedy is, obviously, because if you took it, say, use a modern terminology like a core belief, the core beliefs are those sort of three things that allow passions to exist, that external things can have can be valuable, that they can have, the kind of value that basically she was talking about. Instead, the principles counteract that at every turn. So for example, it says things like, well, you're insignificant and you'll soon die, so don't hang on to anything too tightly. And then it goes in further and says, act as if whatever you get is exactly what you wished for. So lots of things like that are supposed to be built in, sort of baked into the core of your experiencing of the world, so that whatever propositions you formed are formed against that sort of philosophical landscape. And that's that point. Sellers wrote an article on Prosoke, as I think it's called Roman Stoic Mindfulness, really good read. And he was saying, unlike what psychologists have done with modern mindfulness practices as a distress management kind of thing, instead we should be using Prosoke not just to calm ourselves down and focus on, distress management, calming down our inner state, but rather inculcating these philosophical kind of views at the same time, because that's where the therapy will take place. So we're not just kicking out one bad thought, we're actually trying to change the whole kind of belief structure in the background that all these things kind of sit upon, so to speak. So anyway.
Yeah, so, and just one more point about instantiation. And I think this is a really profound thought, but perhaps more profound than we might at first think, because, and it goes back to, again, nature, again, a very important idea for the Stoics. So if, for instance, you see it in various mammal species, if for whatever reason an offspring dies, the mother animal will willingly take on another offspring or another orphan in its place. And we also see that in human behavior. So for instance, say parents who've suffered a terrible tragedy with the loss of their children, you often see that they put a huge amount of effort or passion into, say, a charity or whatever. So I think this idea around instantiation is actually recognizing that there is this tendency in human and animal behavior, that there is this overflow of connection, and if it doesn't have the target that it previously had, it will of necessity flow onto something else. So I think there's a recognition there around what actually takes place, and again, according to nature. So I think it's a really profound idea that it can and should be recognized, and as a phenomenon that's not or a phenomenon that can have a positive outcome.
They say we love somebody, just to follow this through, but we don't want to make the mistake that we did in the past, because we made them the most important human being in the world, and then when we lost them, we obviously were torn in two. We oscillated backwards and forwards until our head fell off. So that means next time we meet people and we have relationships or friendships with them that might blossom into romantic ones, for example. But the Stoic view on this is kind of interesting, because it kind of flies in the face of modern concepts of romance, I guess, because obviously we're not going to think of that person as extremely, well, it's not that they're not important to us, but more important to us than, say, I don't know, any other close member of our family, for example. That if something happened to them, if they left us or if they died, then our life would not be diminished in any significant way, really. I mean, that's basically what they're saying, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we got that out of the way. Don't tell your partner, because it does come up sometimes, and you don't really care about me that much. Yeah, I do. I've got this duty to. So yeah.
All right, who's doing section 4?
I can
Well,
do 4.
Good.
Yeah. Are you going to do 5 then, Jody?
Yeah, I can do 5.
I just chickened out of 5. It looks pretty long. Okay, 4. The passions are all closely related to each other, resting as they do on some kind of high evaluation of externals. Yes, we've talked a bit about that. They become classified according to two distinctions. So we got the distinction between good and bad as our first distinction, and the distinction between past and present. Past and present? Sorry, my bad. Present and future. What the hell am I talking about? Thus, there are 4 basic emotions. Judgment. 1, judgment that what is presently at hand is good. She calls delight. Hedone, presumably say it like that. Judgment that something still in the future is good or valuable. So that's longing or appetition, epithumia. And 3, judgment that what is presently at hand is bad. So that's distress or lupe. And number 4, judgment that what is still in the future is bad, fear, or phobos. There are in each numerous subspecies, depending on the content of the specific proposition. She gives a whole bunch of examples, but for example, pity is distress at the undeserved sufferings of another. Envy is distress at the good fortunes of others, viewed as a bad thing for me. And this comes with, as we've seen in the past part that we were talking about, this kinetic character. So there are descriptions of the kinetic character of some of these judgments. So depression is a distress that weighs us down. Exasperation is a distress that coops us up and makes us feel that we haven't got enough room. Confusion is an irrational distraction that scrapes away at us and prevents us seeing what is at hand. I love this. I just think this is what makes the Stoic philosophy so rich. These phenomenological descriptions show us that the Stoics don't neglect the way the passions feel. They insist that the thing that feels like this is an act of assent or acknowledgement. So this feeling is actually the act or assent. So it's a really important thing. If you catch yourself having a passion, well, then you're in the act of assent, to a certain kind of one of these kind of propositions. Some recognitions feel like embracing a nail. Others like rubbing yourself across a rough, grating surface. Other prepositions cut differently. And this is really interesting because throughout this and in chapter 12, when she talks about Medea, there is this constant notion of cutting or stabbing yourself with the nail thing she's talking about, this kind of way that these passions violently tear into us and damage us. So we know that the Stoics are interested in this kind of everything is a sorry, I'm just listening to reading the chat box. Sorry, don't wish to be rude, have been enjoying, I'm in commute. Okay, hi Lee. Yep, no worries. Don't do that. Anyway, so as I was saying, yeah, this idea that the whole world is well, all the things that exist are bodies of some sort, right? And so we even get this all throughout this description of the way propositions work with us. There's this this experiencing of ascent is actually a physical experience in this case.
Yeah, sorry, can I just come in there, Courtney? And
Yeah.
so we're just reading Diogenes Laertius in the last couple of weeks, and I noticed several times that negative emotions are expressed as contraction and sort of a shrinking, and that's such a profound kind of insight again into how negative emotions manifest. It is like a shrinking. It makes a person reluctant to, well, they do, you know, sort of close in on themselves if they've got a negative emotion. It's such a profound and yeah, insightful expression of the phenomenology of these negative emotions. And it's, yeah, it's something I've got to think some more about, because it's so so interesting and yeah, just amazingly kind of yeah, just really beautiful insight, I guess. Sorry, I'll just, yeah.
And the positive ones are the opposite. So you have joy and you feel a welling up inside of you and a kind of expansion of your character. And I think that's why they make anger a form of the good, because when you're angry, you don't feel like you're shrinking down. You tend to feel like you're expanding and getting bigger. So there's this, rather than like the way we tend to do it is good and bad, positive, negative, it's almost got this physical character that is just as descriptive, you know, or used to characterize whether it be aversion or desire, because desire is obviously the reaching out, so the expansion. Aversion is the opposite of reaching out, obviously. So it's fascinating, and it really grounds it in that physicalist kind of account, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, I was fascinated by, you know, those examples of longing also included hatred, love of quarreling, anger, wrath, resentment, you know, those negative qualities, you know. Interesting, very interesting.
It's really interesting, though, you know, we're talking about these physical things of expansion or shrinking down, but why is it, and I really want to get my head around this, like, why is it that some kinds of ascent, like for example to a lost lover, acts like a knife, and in her telling anyway, and it injures us, and I guess it's because it's an external object, and the external object operates in a way, the way that we the beliefs we have about it, that cause it to become a kind of weapon that wounds us somehow. It causes us an injury, and obviously having that kind of belief is the thing that does the injury, but it means that having that kind of belief causes oscillation within us, which tears the fibers of us somehow. You know, that's a really fascinating kind of concept. So she says, yeah, just to go on about that, was other prepositions cut differently. These emotions are concrete episodes of passion to be identified by highly specific evaluative beliefs about one's situation. So that's more what we're just saying. There are also more general beliefs that generate passions. The entrenched beliefs about the value of certain sorts of externals that internalized in a person's ongoing conception of value are the stable basis for concrete outbursts of passion. Yeah, so they harden in us, as that word hexus, right? Chrysippus says soul is like a body that is prone to certain diseases, some large, some small, which may arise from chance causes. These diseases are diseased conditions of belief. Anosema is one of them, or chronic illness of the soul, is a stable condition of the personality that consists in accepting a value judgment that leaves its holder susceptible to passions. It is defined as a belief in the desirability of something that gets strengthened into a disposition and hardens, according to which they take things that are not choice-worthy to be strongly choice-worthy. So it's the basis of the first part of the disease. Chrysippus added that when such an illness is deeply enough entrenched and generates psychological weakness, we should call the condition of nosemata and weakness and arosthema, or infirmity. What this implies is we cannot have one emotion without letting ourselves in for many others. Once we are hostages of fortune, the very course of life will bring us now to grief, now into fear, now into intense joy. Just as there is a unity among the virtues, all being forms of correct apprehension of the self-sufficient good, just so there is a unity to the passions and also to their underlying dispositional states. But this means too that there is unity to the cure of the passions. I think you were talking about this before, Jody. You will cease to fear if you cease to hope. Both belong to a soul that is hanging in suspense, to a soul that is made anxious by concern with the future, says Seneca in his letter 5. The world's vulnerable gifts, cherished, give rise to the passionate life, despised to a life of calm. What fortune does not give, she does not take away, Seneca says. And that takes us to the next part.
And I love the one too that he says, you will cease to fear if you cease to hope. Isn't that's it's another good one. Do you want me to start on 5, folks, while I just get into it? Okay.
Absolutely.
So, yep, 389 starts 5. The Stoics teach that the passions should be extirpated, not just moderated, which is what the Aristotelian school also proposes. But the Stoics deny that the Stoics deny the natural origin of the passions and their presence in animals and children, interestingly. So they do have the view that animals don't have emotions. Okay, that's all right. So the Stoics describe the wise person as totally free from passion, free from all vulnerability and passivity towards the world. The wise person is totally self-sufficient. The soul is serene. Now, there's 3 Stoic arguments given here against the passions. So there's these 3 arguments, and I'll start with 1. So Nukidian learns that the judgments with which the passions...
Good night.
The Nukidian learns that the judgments with which the passions are identical are false. So that's that idea that, you know, the beliefs are false, that that originate the passions. Externals have no intrinsic ethical value. The Aristotelian theory of value or judgments appears closer to our intuitions, so or the more common beliefs. In the notes, it says, when a baby is born from the warm, wet womb to a cold, dry room, it is quickly bathed in warm water, and thus learning that pain is to be avoided. So it's that idea even from birth, we are conditioned to avoid pain and seek pleasure, which is that Epicurean idea. So that idea of value judgments, you know, we start early with our value judgments. 391 we're on. The Stoics claim that we will be freed from the domination of our passions. They view the account of passion as offering serious support to the theory of good. Epictetus claims that if he discovered that the belief that the external is nothing to us is false, Epictetus claims that if he discovered that the belief that the external is nothing to us is false, and the argument that supports its deceptions, he would still cling to that deception, since from it he is likely to live a smooth and undisturbed in an undisturbed way. I thought that was really lovely. You know, if it, because it won't be claimed to be false, because it is true. But he's saying if it was ever claimed to be false, he'd still live that way anyway. Well, that was great. Okay, number 2. Secondly, the Stoics also claim that the passions are not as important as the Aristotelians think in motivating virtuous action, as a healthy mind can be motivated to correct action by the thought, virtue, and duty alone. By the thought, virtue, and duty alone, and in a more secure and reliable way. Seneca, in On Anger, says a man will still avenge his loved ones and protect them. He will be undisturbed and unafraid, doing what is worthy of a good man. He being constant and secure, reliable, passionless, like the law. So he makes the analogy there to the law: secure, constant, reliable, and passionless. So the point there that was being made, secondly, that that we don't need to be angry or passionate to perform our virtues and duties. The Aristotelians seem to think that we may use those passions positively, but the Stoics deny that. Okay, up to there. 392. But Aristotle claims that an action, in order to be really virtuous, must not only have the same content as the virtuous man's action, it must be done in the way a man of practical wisdom would do it, with those very motives, those very reactive feelings, showing a recognition of the proper and high importance of certain externals, revealing cares and commitments as ethically valuable. So that's a really different approach. So if you believe that, you're not a Stoic, you are an Aristotelian, because they are vouching right from the outset that the high importance of certain externals, that revealing care and commitment emotionally is ethically valuable, right? So that's just totally in another club, isn't it? You either believe that or you believe that.
Not in our club.
Thirdly, experience of the passions gives intensely painful feelings, right? So that's a good argument against them. Their underlying dispositional bases are forms of chronic illness, violent pains and upheavals of the organism, or a chronic condition of weakness and lassitude, plus discomforts and agonies and torments. So, this whole sort of that physical side of the struggle and the discomfort and the pain of passion. So on page 393, Seneca's On Anger, the description includes swelling and distortion and hideousness when he's talking about anger. So that idea of the swelling or the enlarging, or that idea of anger as swelling. And then also with intense joy, there's that feeling of being exposed or fragile or ungrounded. And in passionate love, that feeling of, that scary feeling, unpredictableness, upsetting and anxious, all those sorts of feelings. A person in a state of strong passions could be considered weak and infirm or debilitated, lacking in solidity. And there's a comparison there to the physical state of the muscles. So you were getting that comparison across to, again, that physicality in the body. It's a somewhat circular argument in the sense that, that's what I was saying before, you either believe that or that, so Nikidian won't be overwhelmed by the obvious fact that passions are disturbing, that, she might think, okay, that's okay, I don't mind. I don't care if I'm disturbed by passions, so what's the problem, So the Stoics have detailed the phenomenology of the strong passions, showing the magnitude of this disturbance. We're on 394, by the way. Therefore, the intuitions of Nikidian may weaken in regards to appropriate anger, for example. So she might still want to hold that Aristotelian idea that, you know, there is a certain level of anger that's acceptable, you know. So two more arguments are added to this third one. One, the argument from integrity, and two, the argument from excess. So, so the argument from integrity is about the fact that if we are to extirpate the passions and work towards that, our selfhood, our identity is made stronger, and there's an abhorring of slavery. So we you know, the value of freedom in a sense. Even Aristotle ascribed supreme value of virtue over external items. 395, we're on. If Nikidian opens herself to external goods and invasion and control by the world, she could lose personal dignity and integrity. Okay, so if we can avoid attachment to externals, we are more able to maintain our selfhood, our identity, our integrity.
Yeah, I have a view on this, but I don't think it's commonly shared from what I've found. But it's that in my own personal experience, to lose one, or to feel like you're losing one's agency and freedom because of your relationship to external things, for me was a real wake-up call, and that is what caused me to believe in this approach. And I think that would be a really good thing if people had a real shake-up like that. But it's not widely shared, I don't think. Maybe you guys have an opinion, but other people I've asked about don't really seem to reflect much on this aspect, the agency and the freedom that the Stoics, this argument for integrity, for example. But I think it's incredibly central, and probably because I read mostly Epictetus, but Epictetus was a slave, right? So he's obviously quite honed into the idea of being some, like, even his name means acquired, doesn't it? It like, and that's there's a real central message in his F Haman, or whatever it's called, the what is up to me. It's the idea that we are a rational integrity. That's the center of it. And that's the one thing that you have to look after.
But, and really interesting, remember, was it last year we did that essay by Annas on sort of psychological breakdown? So, and I thought this was really interesting to compare the etymology that Chrysippus brings up, distress lupe, and, you know, who knows if he's accurate in his etymology, but he traced it to the verb luo, which means to dissolve.
To dissolve.
So likening this this distress to the dissolution of the person or the entity. And so, yes, I think there's this very strong notion around integrity as psychic wholeness that's being gestured to here.
Yeah, isn't it great? You know, yes, wonderful. The derivation of words is just incredible. Well, I'll race on. In the world of change, we're on 395. In the world of change, there's a possible violation of self or abasement and humiliation if we open ourselves to it. The Stoic can never be penetrated. He and his good are safely home together, as you know, that Seneca quote. All my goods are with me, in Seneca letter 9. An impregnable wall is built around the self. Again, unless Nikidian believes that virtue is the supreme good, she will not be convinced that the Stoic has all good things at home with her. So again, it's a matter of belief, isn't it? It's a matter of accepting the dogma or not.
Did you read? You missed the really hardcore bit. Like, happenings in that world can then lacerate it, rip it limb from limb. It can be enslaved. This is for the Aristotelian agent, raped and even devoured by another. And like you said, the Stoic is able to avoid that. It makes me think of Jordan Peterson's views on Stoicism, because he says it's a delusion.
Wow. Wow. 396. So secondly, the argument from excess. So Stoics believe passion cannot be moderated or controlled, right? So passions have in their nature a propensity to ungovernable excess. They will tend to increase. So Chrysippus in Galen on passions uses the metaphor of walking and running. So running being harder to control or to stop or to change direction. Like there's more force involved just from the physics of it, you know. Running would be harder to you know, there's so much more momentum in running. The Stoic reason is like walking. And so 2 points are made by these arguments. One, internal structure of each passion can be taken singly, right? So if we just look at the each passion singly, so we just take one at a time. So we can see that they cannot be controlled or limited. It just can run away to the very bottom, as Seneca says in De Ira, like being and the metaphor there is like someone being dropped from a height. They can't stop themselves from falling. They're going to hit the bottom, to the very bottom. So Chrysippus on 397 now, Chrysippus insists that those in passion disdain planning and control by its very nature. So he's saying, you know, if you're involved and absorbed in passion, you actually get so swept away that you don't want to stop it, you don't want to slow it down. So for example, you know, people wanting to be carried away by love, you know, lines from Menander, for example, this quote says, "I took my good sense and stuffed it into a dart."
And so that just goes back to Courtney's point about the person he knows who actively cultivates this this high from a lack of control, or who cultivates the high of the emotion. I mean, there is for some people there's an attraction in that in that loss of control, or that excessive state.
And for anger, the rejection of limit and measure may be harmful. So we could actually really be damaged by the fact that we don't try to limit or measure our anger. Seneca says anger cannot reliably be stopped short of cruelty and murderousness. For example, using Nero as the example. And then secondly, then Nikidian might say, I will get rid of anger and jealousy, but keep love and pity and maybe fear, you know, so that I'm getting rid of the bad stuff. I'm just going to keep the good stuff. And, you know, but the fact is that no, you know, because she's saying, well, really, there's nothing wrong with the first two, because there's no harmful excess of the first two of love and pity. And I can't harm others by being fearful. So she's sort of arguing, oh, you know, I could keep them. But Stoics say, no, this is implausible and not consistent. This is impossible. They're all linked, because as soon as you have one passion, it will invite another passion, or the opposite passion. If you lose the thing that you're passionate about or gain, the argument is, this argument is the most powerful, according to Nussbaum, as it is only in the Stoic life that we can have stable gentleness and beneficence, the avoidance of terrible acts. That wise men are harmless to others and themselves. And that's from Diogenes Laertius.
And you know, the interesting thing though is if you take this argument to any psychologist, basically, they'll just tell you you're full of shit, because they'll say, don't you know that the passions are part of the makeup of your being, and they require expression, and if you don't find healthy ways to express them, then you will be doing yourself some great harm and you won't be living a full or meaningful life. That's the common mainstream kind of argument, you know, that's just accepted, you know. And interestingly, you know, talking about this, I was quite interested. Mr. Daltrey's mentioned her a few times, that Lisa Feldman Barrett, the cognitive neuroscientist, and I looked her up. She's really well recognized. She's done like 30 plus years of research in the field of emotion and cognition and stuff like that. She knows her stuff. And she says something very similar in some respects to the Stoics. She says that emotions are just guesses. We're constructing, using our brains or whatever, like very sophisticated predictions. We're making predictions all the time. There's nothing in them. She even argues this. She's saying it's not that we have to be passive to them. We don't have to be controlled by them. If we saw them for what we were, as like attempts at making predictions, we could influence them. We could be more constructively involved in the way we use emotions to get more out of our lives. So, you know, it's just another way of saying the same thing. We shouldn't be led around by the nose by them. There's nothing, it's just pure superstition, just like Christianity or something, to suggest that there's a part of the soul which requires a certain kind of expression, even though it seems completely alien to reason. And we're the ones who get called a bunch of idiotic jokers. It's just because we're not superstitious enough to follow the mainstream. There you go.
All right,
We're
well, why
not-
don't I rush through 6 and then, because there's not much to go yet. All right, so what's Nikitia left with if she completes the Stoic therapy? Because it looks a bit dire from here. And as Zeno puts it, she may still have the scars of her former condition. So what's she going to be able to keep? Well, she can have the good emotions, eupathei. They're not passions, and they're not identified with any high evaluation of externals. So there's prudent caution, eulabeia, and there's rational wishing or planning, bolesis. There's a certain sort of joy, kara, and there's rational uplift, eulogos epasis. So, and how does Seneca put it in Latin? He says, I do not want you, that's Lucilius, ever to lack gladness, laetitia. Other cheerful things, hilaritates, which are kind of, you know, we don't have a good expression for hilaritas in English. Interestingly, so, you know, sidebar, several coins in Marcus Aurelius's reign early on, or actually possibly even before he became sole ruler, when he was still a Caesar under Antoninus, they had hilaritas on them. So they're like an impersonation of Stoic joy. So there you go. Interesting sidebar for the future. And so Seneca says in letter 23, the soul must be brisk and confident, raised up above everything. But he also says, and this is in letter 23 again, true joy, that's gaudium, is a stern matter, res severa. It's not sort of frivolous, it's kind of serious. Look to the true good and take joy only in that which comes from what is your own. What do I mean by what is your own? I mean you yourself and your own best part. So in the following chapters, we are going to look further at these motivations that we may all have for going over this joy. But as we can see, it's already quite a change. It's from the roller coaster of normal, or what's considered to be normal emotional life, to solid self-absorption, from surprise and spontaneity to measured watchfulness, from wonder at the separate and external to security in that which is oneself and one's own. It is a change that leaves no part of life untouched. And Epictetus, imagine speaking to Medea, He gives her one simple formula for happiness. Stop wanting your husband, and there is not one of the things you want that will fail to happen. So it's not modification. It's what the Stoics said it was. It is extirpation.
Yeah, she just makes you want to go, hallelujah. Hell yeah. Let's tear this shit up. Well, that was wonderful. Thanks,
That's great.
guys.
Yeah. How good is
Anything
that?
you want to say in closing?
No,
I
that was
just
an
lo-
excellent discussion, excellent chapter. Thanks, guys.
Oh, yeah. I just love that, solid self-absorption, measured watchfulness, security in what is one's own. I just
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to reread and talk about it again, because I feel like I got a lot more out of it this time. So that was wonderful.
Yeah, I can see down the track I'm going to have to read it all again myself. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, such a good one. All right, guys.
thank
Well,
you. We'll
I'll
see
let
you.
you go and get on with your
Yeah,
lives.
yeah,
Thank you very
yeah.
much. Catch you at the Providence on Saturday. I better do a thing for it.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Good night.